Aaron Hernandez had millions of dollars, an NFL career, and everything to lose. Yet long before he was convicted of murder, there were signs that something was seriously wrong. From his childhood to what football did to his brain, his path to violence started years earlier. Let's get into it. June 2013. Aaron Hernandez is 23 years old and sitting on a 5-year, $40 million contract extension with the New England Patriots. He's caught touchdowns from Tom Brady in a Super Bowl. He's got a fiancée, a baby daughter, a house in North Attleboro. On paper, he's exactly what the league wants to sell you. The athlete who made it out. Then, in the early hours of June 17th, Bristol County First Assistant District Attorney William McCauley claims Odin Lloyd was last seen alive with Aaron Hernandez at about 2:30 a.m. Lloyd wasn't a stranger. He was dating the sister of Hernandez's fiancée, practically family. Hours later, he was found shot 6 times in an industrial park less than a mile from Hernandez's home. Investigators didn't have to look far. Hernandez was the only person who knew Lloyd in the area, which is a very well-to-do community where murders and other serious crimes rarely ever happen. Within days, Hernandez is arrested on a murder charge in Lloyd's slaying and taken from his home in handcuffs. The Patriots release him hours after his arrest. That's the first collapse, but it wasn't the last. While Hernandez sat in jail awaiting trial for Lloyd, cold case detectives went back to a double murder from the year before. 2 men, Daniel D'Abreu and Safiro Furtado, gunned down outside a Boston nightclub in a drive-by. In June 2013, investigators located the silver SUV seen at the scene of the crime, which was being stored in a garage owned by Hernandez's cousin, and forensic testing on the SUV revealed that ballistic evidence inside the vehicle matched shell casings found at the 2012 murder scene. By May of the following year, Hernandez was indicted for the 2012 double homicide, while he was still waiting to stand trial for Lloyd. So now you've got a Super Bowl tight end connected to 3 killings in the span of about a year. The Lloyd case went to trial first. Aaron Hernandez was found guilty of first-degree murder Wednesday in the June 2013 killing of Odin Lloyd, and after 7 days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict shortly before 10:30 a.m. His defense hadn't even really tried to say he wasn't there. Hernandez's lawyer acknowledged during closing arguments that he was there when Lloyd was killed, but pinned the shooting on Hernandez's 2 friends, saying his client was a 23-year-old kid who didn't know what to do. The jury didn't buy it. Prosecutors said Hernandez planned the killing and then helped cover it up. The conviction carries a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. 2 years later, in a second trial, a jury actually acquitted him of the double murder. Hernandez is found not guilty for the 2012 double murder in Boston's South End on April 14, but it didn't matter. He was never walking out of prison either way. 5 days after that acquittal, Hernandez died early Wednesday morning after he hanged himself by a bedsheet in his prison cell, and he was found dead with the words John 3:16 written on his forehead. That's the shape of the whole thing. A kid with a golden path in front of him, ending up dead in a maximum security cell by his own hand at 27, having taken at least 1 life along the way and been tied to 2 more. The question everyone keeps circling back to is, was this always where he was headed? Was there a version of Aaron Hernandez who never touches a gun, never ends up in that industrial park? To answer that, you have to go back, way back, before the touchdowns, before the contract, to a house in Bristol, Connecticut, and a father who ran it like a drill sergeant. Every story about Aaron Hernandez eventually goes back to his father, because everyone who was close to him says you have to. Dennis Hernandez was a legend in Bristol, a local sports hero himself, the kind of man the town remembered fondly. He was a high school sports star in the town, and closely raised Aaron and his older brother Jonathan to follow in his footsteps. The local sheriff who knew the family described him bluntly. His father was pretty strict. Sheriff Thomas Hodgson of Bristol County told CNN, adding that Dennis used to make him shoot 500 shots before he could go play with his friends. His dad clearly kept them anchored. Anchored is one word for it. Aaron's brother Jonathan used a different one. According to the investigation his brother gave to the Boston Globe, their dad assaulted them with barely any provocation, especially when he was drinking, and turned especially violent when he felt the boys needed to try harder with either school or sports. This wasn't the occasional swat. An investigation by the Boston Globe revealed that Aaron Hernandez had a hard time coming to terms with his sexuality and was the victim of an abusive father who beat him often for not measuring up in school and on the football field, and Jonathan revealed that he and his brother were beaten by their dad and lived in perpetual fear. At one point, Jonathan said their father, Dennis Hernandez, physically abused both of his sons, and even once gave Aaron a black eye over something as small as being sent home from a game. Layer onto that a second wound, one Aaron carried in total secrecy. He was gay, or at least attracted to men, and growing up under a father who by every account had zero tolerance for anything he saw as unmanly. That wasn't something Aaron could ever say out loud. Jonathan Hernandez said that his father was not accepting of any behavior he viewed as unmanly, including when Aaron was young. And Dennis wasn't subtle about it either. Hernandez's father is described as a man's man, who would have taken a dim view of the coming out of one of his sons. So Aaron did what a lot of kids in that position do. He buried it. According to his high school teammate Dennis Sansusi, the two boys had an on and off relationship that started in middle school and ran through high school, and both went to enormous lengths to keep it hidden. Sansusi told the Globe that they had an intermittent sexual relationship that began in middle school and continued through high school, and in his own words, "Me and him were very much into trying to hide what we were doing. We didn't want people to know." Sansusi didn't come out publicly himself until after Hernandez's death, telling the paper he believed his former teammate would be proud of him for finally acknowledging their past. "I really truly feel in my heart I got the thumbs up from him." There's a third layer to the childhood that's harder to pin down but impossible to ignore. Jonathan told the Globe that as an adult, Aaron disclosed that he'd been sexually abused as a young boy. He never said by whom. Jonathan Hernandez told the Globe that Aaron Hernandez disclosed later in his adult life that he had been molested as a young boy. And one of Aaron's lawyers in his criminal case also said Aaron spoke to him of sexual abuse as a child. Details are thin, nobody was ever named. But it's another entry on a growing list of things a teenage boy in that house had zero room to process, let alone talk about. Then, in the middle of Aaron's senior year of high school, the man running that entire operation, the beatings, the shooting drills, the pressure, was suddenly gone. Dennis Hernandez died in 2006 of an infection contracted during hernia surgery, a tragic loss for Hernandez that has sometimes been cited as a key moment in his eventual downfall. People close to the family have said for years that whatever else Dennis was, he was also the one thing standing between Aaron and the wrong crowd. Author James Patterson, who wrote a best-selling book on the case, put it plainly to CNN. If Hernandez's father hadn't died, he would have kept his son away from some troubled people in Bristol. Read that twice. The same man whose fists left a black eye on his son is the same man everyone agrees might have saved him. That's not a contradiction the researchers ever really resolved. And honestly, it's not one the audience needs resolved either. It's just the two truths sitting side by side, an abusive household and a structure that, however brutal, was still a structure. Take the man out, and what's left is a teenager, carrying a secret he can't tell anyone. A body already being trained through violence to associate manhood with dominance, and now no one enforcing any boundaries at all. That's the psychological foundation Aaron Hernandez walked into college football with: fear, shame, suppression. A template for conflict resolution that ran through fists first, and it was about to collide with an entirely different kind of damage. The kind that doesn't come from a household, but from every single football game he ever played. While all of that psychological weight was building, something else was happening that nobody could see in real time. Not his coaches, not his family, not Aaron himself. Every hit, every tackle, every ordinary Sunday collision was quietly reshaping his brain. Hernandez played tight end, a position built on constant contact. Blocking, absorbing hits, getting up, doing it again. He'd been doing it since he was a kid in Bristol, all the way through the University of Florida, all the way into the NFL. And after his death, when scientists finally got a look inside his brain, what they found stunned even the researchers who'd spent their careers studying this exact disease. Hernandez, just 27 when he hanged himself, suffered from chronic traumatic encephalopathy to a degree never before seen by BU researchers in such a young person. Riddled with stage 3 CTE, to a degree that we've never seen in our 468 brains, except for individuals very much older, according to Anne McKee, director of BU's Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center. To put that in perspective, individuals with similar gross findings were at least 46 years old at the time of death. McKee said Hernandez was 27. CTE isn't like a bruise that heals, it's degenerative, and it hits very specific parts of the brain that govern very specific things. McKee said that while she wasn't going to connect the dots with his behavior or difficulties during life, the frontal lobes, and his were very severely affected, are involved in problem solving, judgment, impulse control, and social behavior. And it wasn't just the frontal lobes. The amygdala, which was affected in Aaron Hernandez as well, is involved in emotional regulation, emotional behavior, fear, and anxiety. Stop and think about what that actually means for a second. This is the same organ system responsible for reading social cues, controlling rage, weighing consequences before acting, and Hernandez's version of it by his late 20s looked like it belonged to a man twice his age with the kind of decay you'd see decades into a career, not just a handful of years into one. McKee herself has been careful, publicly, about not drawing a straight line from the disease to the murders. That's a responsible scientist not overstating her data. But other experts studying the case have been more willing to speculate on what that kind of frontal lobe and amygdala damage does to a person's day-to-day decision-making, especially in the frontal lobes, which are very important for decision-making, judgment, and cognition. We could see damage to the inner chambers of the brain, McKee said, and the frontal lobes are also involved in impulse control, empathy, and learning from past experiences. A brain that's losing its ability to learn from past experience, control impulses, and feel empathy is a brain that is, quite literally, losing its brakes. And there's a broader medical context here too. This isn't some fringe theory specific to Hernandez. Individuals diagnosed with CTE have commonly exhibited noticeable cognitive and emotional decline, as well as problems with aggression and impulse control. It's a documented pattern across the sport. CTE's connection to sports has intensified through the suicides of several well-known athletes, including football players Junior Seau and Dave Dewison, who were diagnosed with CTE post-mortem. Hernandez wasn't an isolated case. He was the most extreme version of a pattern that had already claimed other NFL careers and lives. Northeastern researcher Timothy Morris has drawn out the practical version of what this means for someone in Hernandez's position. CTE can lead to personality shifts and a lack of inhibition, potentially influencing an individual's actions. A lack of inhibition in a man who already had, buried underneath everything, an enormous amount of untreated rage, from a childhood that trained him to answer fear and shame with violence. That's not two separate problems, that's one problem stacking on top of another. A brain increasingly unable to hit the brakes, driving a person whose only real model for conflict was force. There's also a genetic piece to this that rarely gets talked about outside the neurology journals. McKee noted that Hernandez had a genetic marker that makes people vulnerable to brain disease, meaning his brain may have been more susceptible to the damage football was inflicting than the average players. Different people absorbing the exact same hits, and Hernandez's brain quietly deteriorating faster and worse than most. None of this happened in a vacuum either. His estate would go on to sue over exactly this. Hernandez's CTE prompted the players' estate to sue the National Football League and the Patriots, arguing that they knew repeated head trauma could cause disease and had failed to protect Hernandez. The suit didn't undo anything, nothing could, but it put on the record formally what the autopsy had already suggested, that an institution built to profit from exactly the kind of physical force that was breaking down Hernandez's brain never stepped in to warn him, treat him, or pull him out. So now you've got two forces converging on the same young man at the exact same time. A childhood that taught him violence was how you survived shame and fear. And a brain that hit by hit, year by year, was steadily losing whatever capacity it had left to stop him from acting on either. Two separate stories, one outcome. By the time Aaron Hernandez was catching passes from Tom Brady, the damage was no longer theoretical. It was showing up in real time, in real decisions, in patterns that people around him kept noticing and kept explaining away, because he was talented, because he was young, because everyone assumed whatever was wrong would sort itself out once the pressure eased. It never did, it got worse. Even before the murders, there were warning signs that read very differently in hindsight than they did at the time. A fight in college. Failed drug tests that slid him down draft boards, friends from Bristol who kept turning up around him even after he'd made it to the NFL. The same troubled people that his father, by every account, had once kept at arm's length. Once Dennis was gone, nobody in Aaron's orbit had the authority or the willingness to do that job again. Then came the double murder outside the Boston club in 2012. A prosecutor's theory that Hernandez was angry because Deabre accidentally bumped into him at a nightclub while dancing, spilling his drink. Read that motive again. A man ends up connected to 2 deaths over a spilled drink. That's not the reaction of someone weighing consequences. That's the reaction of someone whose frontal lobe has already stopped doing its job. Someone who, per the very definition McKee gave, has lost the capacity for problem-solving judgment impulse control. A shove on a dance floor turned into gunfire. The pattern kept repeating. Prosecutors later said Hernandez shot his own associate, Alexander Bradley, after Bradley made a remark about the double murder, believing Bradley had become a liability as a witness. During the Lloyd trial, Bradley took the stand and described how casually the violence had escalated. He testified that Hernandez opened fire on a car because he believed 2 men inside had taunted him at a Boston nightclub, testifying for 4 days in total. A taunt, a bumped drink, a friend who knew too much, every single one of these triggers is small. The responses were not. Then came June 2013 and Odin Lloyd. Whatever conversation happened between Hernandez and Lloyd in the hours before dawn, it ended with Lloyd shot multiple times and left in an industrial park a short drive from Hernandez's own front door. Prosecutors argued this wasn't an impulsive blow-up like the nightclub shooting. They said Hernandez planned the killing and then helped cover it up. If that's true, it tells you something even darker than the lost his temper theory. That by this point, violence wasn't just an impulsive failure of restraint anymore. It had become a tool he reached for deliberately, the same way another person might reach for a difficult conversation or a lawyer. The impulse control was gone, but so, increasingly, was any internal alarm bell telling him this was wrong in the first place. The contract offer that had just landed, the one worth a 5-year, $40 million deal, offered just 2 months before the murder, didn't stop it, didn't even slow it down. Everything the outside world would consider a reason to protect what you have meant nothing. Against whatever was actually driving him by that point, the arrest came fast. Hernandez was arrested on a murder charge in Lloyd's slaying and taken from his home in handcuffs, and the Patriots released him hours later. The team that had just paid him tens of millions of dollars cut him loose. Within a single news cycle, whatever image had been built, star tight end, family man, success story out of Bristol, came apart that fast because it was never load-bearing to begin with. It was sitting on top of everything we've already talked about. The beatings, the secret, the CTE quietly eating through his ability to regulate any of it. Even locked up awaiting trial, the pattern didn't stop. It just changed shape. Prison records tell their own story about a man who never found the breaks, even behind bars. His prison discipline records indicate the former Patriots tight end notched a dozen offenses between May 2015 and October 2016, including 3 fistfights and the possession of a 5.34-inch sharpened metal shiv. In one documented incident, Hernandez was caught on video surveillance punching another inmate in the face, after the man tried shaking his hand and they had to be broken up with a chemical agent. After one of those fights, he reportedly turned to a guard and said, unprompted, "This place ain't shit to me. I'll run this place and keep running shit." That's not a man reflecting on what brought him there. That's the exact same wiring from the nightclub, from the industrial park, still running unchanged inside a cell. The environment changed, nothing else did, and underneath all of it, the thing he'd spent his entire life hiding never stopped costing him either. Investigators and reporters who spent years on the case have pointed to a relationship he began while incarcerated with a fellow inmate named Kyle Kennedy as evidence that the identity he'd suppressed since childhood never actually went away. It had just been forced further underground into the one place left where nobody from Bristol, nobody from the NFL, nobody from his old life could see it. By the time the second trial arrived, the one over the 2012 double murder, Hernandez was, by every visible measure, someone the system had already fully consumed. He wasn't fighting to save a football career anymore. He was fighting to save what was left of a life that had already collapsed in on itself. And when a jury actually acquitted him on that second case, the one thing everyone expected to happen, relief, a sense of vindication, some shift never came. Because underneath the specific charges, the actual damage had never been about any single case. It was systemic, years deep, and it wasn't going anywhere, no matter what a jury decided. 5 days. That's how long Aaron Hernandez lived after a jury told him, officially, that he hadn't committed the double murder in Boston 5 days after the one piece of good legal news he'd gotten in years. And instead of relief, what came next was the end of everything. Correction officers told police that Hernandez had been locked in his cell just before 8 p.m. and remained there until the following day just after 3 a.m. when he was found hanging. He hadn't been flagged as a risk. A spokesman for the Massachusetts Department of Corrections said there was no prior concern, that Hernandez was suicidal, and that if there had been, he would have been on mental health watch in a different part of the prison. Nobody saw it coming, at least not on paper, but the scene he left behind wasn't the scene of a man acting on a sudden, unplanned impulse. The night of his death, Hernandez had placed a large amount of shampoo on the floor of his cell, making it very slippery, and had pegged the door by stuffing its tracks with cardboard, making entry difficult. This was planned, methodical, deliberate, the opposite of the loss of control narrative that had defined so much of his life, and yet the ending of it carried the same eerie signature as everything before it. Hernandez was found dead with the words John 3:16 written on his forehead, a note of religious meaning scrawled onto himself in his final act in blood. He left 3 letters behind, next to a Bible, before hanging himself. Hernandez scribbled notes to 3 people: his fiancée Cheyenne Jenkins Hernandez, their 4-year-old daughter Avielle, and his prison lover Kyle Kennedy. To his fiancée, he wrote a line that reads now like the final confirmation of everything he'd never been able to say directly for years. I told you what was coming indirectly. He'd apparently been trying to tell her, in his own coded way, that this was where it was headed, and she either hadn't caught it or hadn't believed it. The same way, almost nobody around him ever caught the full weight of what he was carrying until it was already too late. His attorney, Jose Baez, who'd grown close to him in the final year of his life, later said Hernandez had seemed almost lighter in his final hours. On what would be the final night of his life, Hernandez seemed happy and excited for the future. That detail is the one that should sit with you the longest. A man who spends the last hours of his life appearing at peace, then methodically prepares his own cell to make sure no one can stop what he's about to do. That's not a person losing control. That's a person who has already made the decision and found in making it something that finally felt like relief. So what do you do with all of this? A father who beat him and also might have saved him. A secret he could never speak out loud in a house that would have destroyed him for it. A brain quietly disintegrating from the very sport that made him rich and famous, stripping away the exact machinery a person needs to control rage, read consequences, feel empathy. And a series of escalating acts of violence that moved step by step from a shove on a dance floor to a planned killing in an industrial park to a decade-defining collapse that ended with him alone in a cell at 27. No single piece of that story explains the whole thing by itself. Take away the CTE and you still have a man raised to answer fear and shame with his fists. Take away the childhood and you still have a brain, by McKee's own account, more damaged than anyone her research team had ever seen in someone that young. A brain that had lost the machinery for judgment and impulse control regardless of what kind of man was walking around inside it. Take away the secret sexuality he spent his whole life hiding, and you remove one more source of shame and fear stacked on top of everything else, but you don't remove the rest. Put them together though, and you get something that looks less like a mystery and more like a diagnosis playing out in real time. Trauma laid down early, reinforced by violence at home, compounded year after year by a sport that was physically eroding the very organ meant to keep all of it in check, every piece feeding the next. A father's fists teaching a lesson the brain would later lose the ability to override. A secret with nowhere safe to go. A body absorbing hit after hit, while nobody, not the team, not the league, not the people closest to him, understood what that damage was actually doing underneath the surface. Odin Lloyd never got to grow old, neither did Aaron Hernandez. And what's left years later is a case study that keeps getting picked back up by researchers, by documentary crews, by anyone trying to understand how so many different kinds of damage can converge on one person and produce an outcome that, looking back, almost nobody around him seemed able to stop. And that looking at everything laid out end to end might never really have had another ending at all.